So we already have 20 participants. For me here, it's good afternoon. I guess for many people, it's further later on, and for others earlier. So I think we have enough people to start, and I will start by introducing myself. I'm Rodrigo Assunção. I'm the moderator of this session today. I have just joined the ILO as a MIS specialist, which is still something I'm elaborating. But anyway, my experience comes with dealing with IT systems for social protection within the governmental context, mostly within the government of Brazil, and now dealing with the implementation of MIS projects within the ILO. I would like to invite my colleagues here as resource persons to present themselves in a minute, but we have this presentation that talks about what we're doing here today. And so this clinic is the digital solutions for social protection responses to COVID-19 payments. I'm sure most of you that have managed to connect to this link already knew that. But this session is hosted by SPIAC-B, the Digital Social Protection Work Group, the Social Protection Interagency Coordination Board, as well as SPACE, Social Protection Approaches to COVID-19 Expert Advice, funded by the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office and the German Development Corporation. So, the moderators that we have here, as I said, I presented myself, Rodrigo Assunção, and the resource persons listed here will introduce themselves. So perhaps if you could do that, you can either follow the order or up to you, actually. So would you like to start?
I can go ahead. Thank you, Rodrigo. I'm Rodolfo Beasley. I'm a consultant and researcher on social protection. I'm working with SPACE, the facility of expert on social protection responses to COVID. Looking forward to participating in this panel.
Thank you. Hi, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Also from my side, I'm Sylvia Bauer-Jasbeck, and I work for the consultative group to assist the poor, short CGAP, which is a financial inclusion think tank that works to identify barriers and explore financial sector solutions that help poor people build resilience and capture opportunities. So over the past years at CGAP, I've led mostly our work on and research on social assistance payments. And I've looked particularly at how payments can be designed and delivered in ways that allow recipients to access their payments in a more convenient way, in a reliable way, and a safe way. So we really look a lot at the payments part of social assistance programs, and I'm very happy to talk to you today about our experiences that we collect globally, because we look at solutions and experiences globally. So looking forward to the discussion.
Okay. My name is William Devon, and I work for the GSMA. I'm a director for the Mobile for Humanitarian Innovation Program at the GSMA. And as you know, the GSMA is a trade association for the mobile network operators. Thank you.
Hello, I am Kate Glynn Broderick. I work for Innovations for Poverty Action, and we're a global nonprofit that conducts a lot of research. My particular position focuses on financial inclusion. I look a lot at women's empowerment issues, and we conduct research all around the world and are looking forward to the discussion today.
Okay, I don't see John Blomqvist amongst us, but we're very lucky to have Tina George here with us, so she can perhaps present herself now.
Thanks, Rodrigo. My name is Tina George, and I'm a senior social protection specialist with the World Bank. worked on the source book on the foundations of social protection delivery systems. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Please, Ines.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Dina Rodriguez Caliaba. I'm a social protection specialist working at the World Bank, and I focus on social protection delivery systems. And I worked on the recently launched source book on delivery systems Tina just mentioned, and I also support social protection programs in Africa.
Thank you. Alan?
Hello, everybody. I'm Alan Gelb. I'm at the Center for Global Development, and our work has involved looking at the application of digital technology to a range of public services, ranging from identification through to payments. And we recently put out a paper looking at the use of digital technology in delivering social payments for COVID assistance. That's not just the payment side, but the identification, screening, and right through the value chain. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. Okay, so the next step would be for us to check our Slido site, where we have been collecting some questions. There are some questions that were presented in the morning session and already voted, but you can have a look at with this link, have a look, see if you have other questions to add, and if you are happy with the ones that are there, you can vote on them, and we will start in the order of popularity, so to speak. We will start the discussions by addressing the questions that people think should be the most interesting by clicking in the votes. Okay. So we will give all of you a few minutes, something like 5+, so that you can either add your questions or vote on them, so that we can organize the discussion. And of course, that is also true for the resource persons and whoever wants to chip in, either with questions or with the votes. So I'm sensing that the activity on the Slido page is running down. Are we ready to move on, or should we wait for a couple more minutes. Are people still writing? Anybody can unmute and join. Okay, so if people feel that we can start the discussion, then the first question, whether we think, let's see, yeah, I think I'll share that, not as nice as we were having there. How is that appearing? No, I think we have the wrong screen, right?
I think that was the right screen.
It was fine, yeah.
It was fine for me, it appeared something else. Is that the right screen?
Yeah,
Yes.
it's fine.
Yes, those mysteries of, I'm looking at the presentation, but that's fine.
On the bottom left, there's a presenter mode that might be useful.
No, but I'm okay, I have it on the other screen. So, do you think the use of digital payment tools will be sustained beyond the pandemic? Will it be used for the existing cash-based programs as well as, or is this perhaps already happening in some countries? So that was the most popular question. And it was also that in the morning session. And I would ask the resource persons to just join in, whoever would like to start answering. I would ask everybody, including the resource persons, to keep all the answers as short as possible, as objective and to the point as possible, so we can have a lot of participation. And I repeat, the floor is open to all present. The resource persons are here to start the ball rolling, but by no means they are the only ones supposed to score. So please, who wants to start? Please, William.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the process had already started, even before COVID. We've seen a lot of organization moving towards digital tools. So I think that had already started. Certainly, the pandemic increased that, and the pandemic made it more imperative for people to start using digital tools. So I think the foundation for the use of digital tools in cash-based transfer programs, I think, has been set, and that will continue into the future. Thank you.
So if I'm, apologies, just jumping in, but if I may add, so I think we are seeing that in a number of countries, there has been really a leapfrog now to more digital payment methods because of the pandemic. But we are also seeing some countries that reverted to manual delivery of cash. And I think it really largely depends on the systems that are already available. It is really, I think, a learning for us in order to prepare for future crises, that it is important to have a well-functioning digital financial services system in place that you can leverage quickly in order to distribute payments. And a key aspect of this is really the distribution networks, the cash out points, right? And if they are not well disseminated, if they are not maintained open during the crisis. So a lot of governments have actually allowed them to stay open, designated them as essential services. So it's really been important to have these distribution networks in place. So I think there are two sides to it. In the countries that have now really done a move and a switch to digital solutions, I see a huge opportunity for them to also shift other cash transfer programs to these digital solutions. And we are seeing this in a couple of countries where really new services have been introduced and will be expanded also to other social protection and cash transfer programs. But it really depends on the ecosystem that is available. So my tip would also be to really look at the longer term development that this can spur towards more inclusive and more digital financial as service systems.
This is Kate from IPA. Oh, sorry, Rodolfo.
Go ahead, go ahead.
I was going to say what I think is interesting too is that I agree with what both speakers said in terms of what has already been developed is now exacerbated, and so there's been a lot more of a push to do digital social transfers during this time. I think so you need an enabling environment, you need an infrastructure that's already there and able to handle that. And I think one of the interesting questions that's come up is, how do you target a new group of people? So while in a lot of social transfer cases, there were already established enrollment processes and programs that had been developed. And so there were criteria that people met. They were enrolled into these programs, and then they were, the program was implemented either through cash or digital delivery. But now we saw all of a sudden a whole new group of people that had never been targeted before. And I think finding them, identifying them, making sure that those are the people who are in need, and then can get the transfers that were requested or required becomes, was one of the really complicating factors of this, was rolling out, a very large set of social transfer amounts in a variety of delivery mechanisms. So we do still see cash, we do still see digital. I think it's a lot easier for people who are already enrolled in a digital platform, if they already have a bank account, they already have a mobile money platform. A lot of the governments are able to just deposit it right into those accounts. But if people don't, having to onboard them onto the program becomes a whole set of programmatic activities in and of itself, and can be very time consuming and costly and difficult, which once that takes place can then open up an entire environment for additional programs or interventions or communication channels in the future, once this pandemic has once the social transfers related to this pandemic have eased.
Thank you. So, well, I agree with my colleagues. There was already, prior to the pandemic, a trend of countries and programs using digital payments increasingly, although many countries and many programs still rely on manual, let's say, kind of payments. And this crisis, because of the nature of the crisis, of the scale of the crisis, and of the nature of the crisis in terms of safeguarding social distancing and so on, promoted the use of digital payments. And we've seen a lot of innovation in the sector. No? Suddenly countries being able to register or to open bank accounts to new beneficiaries, hundreds, thousands, even millions of beneficiaries in some countries, no? Very, very quickly. The same with mobile payments, no? And I think all this innovation kind of accelerates what was already a trend in terms of adopting digital payments, no? Still, it's important to say that we've seen countries responding with manual transfers, and that can be effective as well, no? And it depends very much on the system that you have in place, no? Over.
I agree with all of what has been said, and I want to emphasize this point of that countries' responses really depend on what the country context is and what the existing experience was with the use of modalities. And I think that we have seen a very wide range of different options. So we see countries that were implementing in-person cash payments and continued that trend. There were countries which were implementing both over-the-counter and accounts-based payments, and for the COVID response payments, they relied only on over-the-counter payments, and this is the case of Ecuador, for example. We see other countries which were already using digital payments, such as Colombia and Brazil, and used it for COVID response. We see other countries with little experience in digital payments, such as Burkina Faso and Congo, and we see them using these payments for COVID response, for at least a percentage of payments. But we see also that there have been big challenges in implementation. So again, it's important to stress the country's context and previous experience. And then we see other countries that, again, didn't have experience or very little in digital payments and started experimenting with this for the COVID response. So there's a very wide range of country experiences.
Are we jumping in or do we wait for you, Rodrigo? Should I just go in? Okay. All right. I don't hear from you, Rodrigo, so I'm just going to jump in.
No, please come right in. It's much easier. And that includes the other members of the audience as well.
Okay, sounds good.
If
All right.
things get chaotic, I will intervene.
Okay, sounds like a plan. All right. So, so to the question of, do we think the use of digital payment tools will be sustained beyond the pandemic? Yes, I think I do agree that this seems to be a tipping point where it might see a lot of the sustenance beyond the pandemic. And it's important to really clarify here that when we talk about manual and digital payments, we're really using it as a short form, right? Because payments aren't really completely manual. If you look at payments, there's the back-end payments administration and then the front-end payments provision. And the back-end payments administration, in more often than not, those payments administration processes are automated and hooked up to public financial management systems with the Treasury in multiple countries. So the question is of that payments provision, what we call the first mile and not the last mile, because people are the first mile. So with the first mile, which is people, what kinds of provision methods are you using? And even in those provision methods, even if we say they're digital, it could be an e-voucher or a smart card. And is that really a digital payment? And I actually think it's not. And this is what we say in the source book. That's not really a digital payment because you can give them the card, but they must still stand up and turn up in line to receive those payments. So I think what we're going to see is probably a shift towards a purely virtualized payments. In some countries, what we're seeing is there is some staggering of payments at physical sites to reduce the crowds and changing the payments frequencies, changing them from monthly to quarterly. And we see this in Angola, Sierra Leone. And in other countries, you see that shift to the mobile money or the e-voucher accounts. And even though these transfers are made virtually, they're closed loop, and so they must be cashed out. And so I think we need to make a distinction. So even when we say it's digital, we need to qualify what that means. And in those cases, there do need to be some guidelines for the physical cash out. And thirdly, I think there's, in terms of the virtual transfers that are deposited in mobile money accounts or bank accounts, that is a direct transfer to the beneficiary's bank accounts if they exist, or mobile money accounts. And for that, a whole range of other components need to be in place, such as know your customer style waivers and the presence of choice and convenience. So I think that we need to qualify what we mean by digitizing payments and that payments provision, and to what extent is it completely virtual? Do I think that it's here to stay? I think that we will continue to push the boundaries. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to note that John Blomquist is here, and perhaps he can also present himself briefly. We are, John, answering the first question, which is basically a discussion about whether we think that the digital payment tools will be sustained beyond the pandemic, and whether it will be used for existing cash-based programs as well, and if this is already happening in some countries. Many of the resource persons have talked. Feel free to talk about this or not, up to you. And again, after John presents himself, I remind everybody that we are open for this discussion, but I think we need to wrap up this question so we can go on to the next one. John, over to you.
Sure, I won't answer because I'm sure we've got a lot of experts that have already weighed in. Just to introduce myself quickly, my name is John Blomquist, and I'm the global lead for delivery systems and social protection at the World Bank. Very happy to be with you, and I know we've got Tina from the bank, and I think maybe even Ines online as well. So well represented. Apologies for being late. I had to re-register for the conference, but I'm back and happy to be here. Thanks.
So are we happy with the discussion of this first question? Would anybody like to add something else in this issue? Alan, is that your hand raised?
Yes, I'd just like to follow up on the very good points made by Tina on what do we mean by digital. And I think this is an important question because in a way, you know, many countries are using things like digital vouchers. And so this is a digital payment. And it's true, you can't do anything with it. You have to cash out. So we think of the transition towards payment into something like a mobile money account that has other functionality. But in most cases, we find that when that happens, at least in the short term, people simply cash out the money anyway, because there isn't an ecosystem around to use it for payments. That they can't use it to pay at local merchants, for example. And so I think it's going to be a long process in moving from the digital back end and the digital voucher type and the initial payment into a mobile account. It's going to be a longer process to go from there into the sort of digital payments by the beneficiaries themselves. That'll be a sort of a second stage. And that's not going to happen so quickly in many countries.
Just one very brief comment on that is that what we have seen, for example, in Brazil, is a transition to paying utility bills, because that is a good stepping point. It's exactly. Easy for many companies to, so that starts this whole trend that will take, as you mentioned, yes, a longer period.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so are we still on this discussion? Or are we happy with it so far, and should we move on to the next? The way this works is I ask this question a couple of times, and if there is no answer, I just move on to the next. So I think we've established that there is no answer, and we go on to the next. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of using one or multiple providers for the delivery of cash transfers, both in general and specifically during the pandemic? So would anyone like to start this one?
Sure, this is John. I feel like I should say something having joined late, so I'll jump in. No, I think the experience that at least we're observing for COVID response is that a lot of countries are leveraging the systems that they've already been using to the extent possible. So that's both identification of beneficiaries, but also payment mechanisms. So if there is already relationships with, say, a mobile money provider or with banks, they're leveraging that and then moving forward. What we see as advantages, however, is the incorporation of multiple providers and choice given to beneficiaries so that they are able to choose which payment service providers best suits them, both in terms of multiple banks per se, using different accounts, or to the extent that people are using mobile money. That does a couple of things. It allows beneficiaries to kind of use the accounts that they're most familiar with, perhaps for which they already have accounts. It also facilitates some degree of competition across different providers which has a tendency to bring down the fees that are charged. So oftentimes in initial startups, you may be looking at 3.5 or 4% fees. At least we've seen that in a number of cases in India and in a couple of cases in Africa. But that fee can be brought down through competition and provider choice. So having the sort of API setup where you can facilitate different providers is really a win-win for most settings. And that's something that we see evolving and something that we would typically recommend. But let me stop there. Others would have more direct experiences. Thanks.
So if I might just add to John's comments, of course, choice and leveraging multiple providers brings a variety of benefits, and John mentioned a couple of them. Another one is also that you can often reach more recipients because multiple providers might cover a broader geography and therewith bring the access points closer to recipients. A very important point during COVID is actually the ability to leverage multiple access points and therewith reduce the amount of recipients that go to the same place. And Tina mentioned before as well, the idea of staggering payments by having less people come to the access point on the same day, because that was a real issue during COVID. At the same time, you can also reduce the pressure on the liquidity management, which means the amount of cash that an access point needs to have in place to distribute all those payments. And that is, of course, lowered if you use more access points through multiple providers. So there are a couple of opportunities and benefits, but I would also mention that leveraging multiple providers is something that is more appropriate and works better when there is an ecosystem already in place, when there are multiple providers that are already reaching into more remote areas or more rural areas, and that you can truly leverage, and they don't have to build new infrastructure in order to distribute those cash transfers. In contexts where you have very little development of the financial service system and the existing distribution channels don't reach yet into these areas where your recipients live, then it might be more adequate to work with a single or with a few providers that you actually support in expanding their networks, the distribution networks, which I mentioned earlier, to reach those recipients. So it's really also depending on the context and on the readiness of your market.
Just to add a couple of points to add on that, I do believe that having, as Sylvia has said, having multiple providers or not depends on the context. But some of the challenges of having that is, is a procurement process. If you're going to be dealing with different providers, then obviously that sometimes poses a challenge depending on the country that you are in. And also dealing with different challenges, because most systems you would find some kind of challenge or complaint. So dealing with that from multiple fronts can also pose a bit of a challenge. So I'll just mention these couple of points on the sort of disadvantage side.
I'll jump in here. Yeah. I'll jump in a little bit here and say that we, in a sense, we're building data infrastructure, and we're building the infrastructure for payments that will probably go beyond the crisis, go beyond COVID, and will influence how we do business going forward. And this is a huge thing in terms of bankerization, in terms of, expanding access to financial technology, tools and instruments. And this has value in the market. Temporary benefits are temporary, and sometimes even the fees are waived because of humanitarian reasons or charged quite highly, as John mentioned. But once you go into more permanent, more long-term benefits, this can be used as collateral for loans. And this can be reverted so that the fees are paid by the banks to the social protection institutions, especially with long-term social insurance. This is already happening. Brazil has been doing that for the past 12 years with enormous financial success. The banks pay the social security institution in order to pay benefits. So moving forward, this is of course not the context for temporary emergency benefits, but moving forward, we should always be aware that we are expanding the market base of the financial system. And this has monetary value as well. And we should not see ourselves as only the payees, but many times we can become the recipients of funds because we are doing that.
So if I could just jump in here, this is Tina. And I think many of us have just talked about how, in terms of the advantages and disadvantages of using one provider versus multiple providers. And we know that more than a fifth of developing countries use cash for social benefits payments. And we also know that the usual motive that we talk about is that the financial ecosystem is really not well developed enough. And so you have these high volume of very low value transactions that need to be transferred at a reasonable cost to the government, and a reasonable cost to the end user, and a reasonable cost to the intermediaries involved as well. And so it does create a range of challenges. And I think when we think about these issues, we again need to be thinking of people as the first mile. And I think in the business of social development and social protection, we need to be talking of people as the first mile, which means we think of this as human-centered design. And so whether you choose one provider or multiple provider has to be anchored in whether it's appropriate for the context, as Sylvia was saying. And let me give you an example. In Indonesia, when Indonesia went overnight to bank accounts for the beneficiaries of the PKH program, the Family Hope program, there were beneficiaries on islands such as in Maluku, which is far out on the eastern side, where there's only one ATM on the island, and you have to walk for miles to go to that ATM to even do the cash out. So, it needs to be context appropriate is, of course, is something that we keep talking about, but especially in the context of COVID, we need to be thinking about what does that multiple provision and multiple provider approach offer us. Another perspective I think that we should really be mindful of is the procurement as well. So the procurement costs as well as the time involved in procuring a single provider versus a competitive model where you have multiple providers involved and you have the ability to offer choice and convenience, such as what Zambia offered in terms of its Jewel program for women and girls.
So thank you. So let me just add something quickly here, and it's so I agree with the comments, and in addition to having multiple service providers, this is the issue of increasing the access points, no? And this is we have seen a number of examples of this in this crisis, no? In many in Latin American countries, in Colombia, Peru, Argentina, and so on, that regardless of if you have one or multiple service providers, but you focus on increasing the access points so that beneficiaries can access the benefits quickly while safeguarding social distancing. We've seen these countries increasing the number of bank branches, shops, ATMs, and so on that can give access to the beneficiaries. Over.
Well, and if I may jump into that, I think that's a very important point that Rodolfo is also raising, which is that this comes also to regulatory aspects. So regulators can actually support this expansion of access points by, for example, reducing or relaxing agent requirements, who is allowed to provide cash out services. So that's a huge topic, and there are a couple of countries that have relaxed that. I know, for example, in Ecuador, they were able, through a change in the regulation or an amendment, to also enable pharmacies and other smaller shops to become cash out agents. And other aspects are also around interoperability, right? So if you have less providers, can you actually leverage other service providers' access points to provide the cash out? And that requires usually a more interoperable plumbing in the background. And that requires rules, that it requires agreements. It's not always quickly implemented, but regulators can support that as well in a crisis. And I think there are some important there's an important role that regulators also play in this context, and where they can help enabling the use of a broader network of access points.
Okay, I'm asking for the first time whether we feel that we should move on in terms of the next question. Does anybody want to talk a little bit more about this, or do we feel we have covered? And while you're thinking about this answer, I'd like to point out that the chat is not only extremely interesting and comprehensive, but extremely linked. People are posting very nice and interesting links that I suggest everybody have a look while we're at it. So, for the second time, are we ready to move on to the next question? So we shall. The third question seems to be interesting and probably a bit polemic. So what data should be collected from the beneficiaries receiving digital payments in order to avoid frauds and errors, but also meeting data privacy and protection standards? The eternal question of how much we collect versus what we can do with it. So anybody would like to jump in? IT people hate this question. The obvious answer is we want everything.
Well, since nobody's talking, I'll just give it a first stab, and then I'll let my colleagues chime in and contribute as well. I think information that is really important to collect is, of course, if available, some type of identification, because you need to be able to identify the recipient, and at the point of cash out, that recipient identity has to be verified. So the information about the identity is really important, and whether they have an ID document. Ideally, there is a national ID document. There might be a national ID number that can be leveraged. So this is, I would say, one of the most important information points. Then ideally you also have, of course, the name to then cross-check. Then also telephone numbers become more and more important, either because you're using mobile money services or because you try to send them a one-time password, which is an alternative way of allowing recipients to access the money, for example, at an ATM, if they don't have a smartphone or if they don't have a card. So that's a different way, a different type of payments instrument. So a mobile phone information also becomes more important. It's also a communication channel, right? So I think these are two really important data points. I'm sure my colleagues who also work more in the area of registration and enrollment have many more ideas. I would just mention, it is always a principle, there should be a principle of collecting only what you really need. Of course, you also want some more information for analysis and for reporting. But I think the security of the data of recipients, and especially also the privacy, is really important and needs to be maintained. So just as a first crack at this question.
I would very quickly add in there that gender disaggregated data is then also important. So really understanding, and this should be part of the research objectives that you'll be looking at, and understanding the program implementation, the effectiveness of the program implementation around whether women and girls are really receiving the payment at the same rate that men are. So understanding who's receiving the payment, problems or challenges that they're having, and being able to analyze that data by gender is also really important.
If I may jump in, I think as Sylvia was just pointed out, this question relates to the topic that was discussed in a previous clinic on registration, because the issue of data to be collected is really related to the intake and registration phase. So this depends on whether, and again, there are different experiences of countries relying on data from existing social registries or other government databases and complementing with other data, or countries which had to rely on new data collection and new applications. Yeah, this is it for now.
Maybe just as one more important point that just came up to my mind is, of course, payments information, right? You need to know, does this recipient already have a bank account, and can that bank account potentially be used in order to channel payments? Exactly. So that would be one more point that I think with my payments hat on, that would be also an important data point.
Yeah.
Just to add to the very good points made already, I think it's also important as to whether or not the mobile number is linked to the ID number, because in some cases, for example, the Namibia program, you were able to use one mobile to file multiple claims, and that was done deliberately so that people would be included. And the claims were designated by the national ID number of the recipient. But of course, that means that when you send a digital voucher, you send it to a recipient, but you have no way of digitally proving who you are, because most national IDs don't have remote authentication capabilities. So for those kinds of systems, they can be very inclusive, but there is that element of risk, right?
So if I may just add in over here, I think I'm trying to parse the question as to what data should be collected from beneficiaries for error fraud, for EFC, and then for data protection and privacy. So I feel like there are two aspects to this. One is the onboarding aspect. So is it the onboarding when you first receive the payment? And then there's the other part, which is the periodic, the receipt of the payments on a periodic basis, or if there's one or two transfers, then that happens appropriately. So I think we need to differentiate between the two, whether it's at the onboarding stage when the beneficiary is coming on board at the first time, or whether it's during the recurring. And in terms of the data points, I think some of the things that we do need, and as Ines was saying, and Sylvia as well. So in addition to that, I would say proof of life. So data on proof of life is important. And then we need to be thinking about this from a perspective of authentication. Are you authenticating individuals at the point of payment service delivery, if this is in person? Or is this an authentication that's happening online and on an ongoing basis? And that helps, and using the identification credentials helps you with the leakages and with the error, fraud, and corruption, especially if you're able to deduplicate individuals and say this is a unique individual, and that individual is a designated recipient for that family or the household or the assistance unit. There are a number of other points, of course, but I would say let's try and structure this to say what data is required at what stage in the life cycle and at what point of the process of payments.
I think William was wanting to join in.
Yeah, Yeah, very briefly, I was just going to build on what Alan said about the verification. When I also agree with Tina that we need to sort of look at the different points. And I was just going to say that we are working with Telco in Somaliland to use voice verification, so that people can, there's a number you can call and it verifies your voice. So the use of biometrics are also coming, and it helps quite a lot in verification, but also reduces fraud and also make sure that we get that single, make sure that we know who we're actually serving.
I think the people who are extremely worried with data protection and are worried as collecting as little as possible should be very happy that we only have 3 or 4 more minutes, because as you can see, the list of data necessary keeps growing as we discuss. In a sense, it's because we are building data infrastructure, as I mentioned. And we do not know how this data is going to be used. And sometimes I think we confuse good data management and good data protection with limiting collection. These are two different things that should be discussed very, very differently. And again, I'm obviously being very provocative here and taking ridiculously advantage of the fact that we're going to be ending the discussion very soon. So would anybody like to keep on discussing this? I don't think we have the time for another question, but I think perhaps this subject has not been exhausted yet. Anybody else?
I want to put in a plug, and I think we didn't probably provide a link to it in the previous session on registration, on intake and registration, is please also take a look at chapter 6 of the source book on the foundations of social protection delivery systems on payments, where we classify all the different modalities and look at all of these aspects on error, fraud, and corruption, on onboarding, on all of the aspects of payments within the social protection delivery systems. Thanks.
Anybody else would like to join in? As mentioned, everybody here in the room is invited to participate. Okay, so we have 5 more minutes. Perhaps we should, I'm going to read the following question and then ask for the resource persons that wish to make their final statements, which they can or cannot address the final question as they wish. And then we will close and point out the Google Doc that we're going to be producing. And of course, the space where we hope that all these questions will be answered or at least addressed. So the next question that we would be discussing, if we had the time, was how can informal workers be targeted effectively and reliably? And what examples are there for emergency cash transfers targeting informal workers? And with that, I invite the resource persons to make their final comments, and whoever else wants to as well.
Let me just say quickly that we tried to cover this issue in a previous clinic, in the one about outreach, registration, and enrollment, because I mean, it has been a huge challenge for social protection in the response to COVID, reaching in particular informal workers. So I invite the participants to go back to that recording. Oh.
Don't worry, there are a few more minutes for you to be shy, so whoever wants.
Just to flag that we have been looking at an unusual case, which is the example of Bihar in India, which developed a social protection payment for migrants, informal migrants who had left Bihar and are coming back. And in order to do that, it was quite difficult because they had to establish that they were actually Biharis, that they had been working outside of Bihar. And so they used the possession of bank accounts in Bihar as not only a payment mechanism, but as an identifier. So that's an interesting case, and that will be up on our website soon. It shows some of the difficulties in this, but also some of the ways that governments have addressed them. Thank you.
Yeah, so in the previous session, in the session on outreach, intake, and registration, we talked quite a bit about Togo's Nuvisi program and how the Nuvisi program has effectively targeted informal sector workers by using an on-demand registration procedure. So I don't want to repeat that again, but we will be putting out a paper on it very soon, and that will be available as well. Thanks.
Hi, this is John. I won't repeat what was said earlier, and indeed we should all look at the earlier recording. This is just to say that you know, this is becoming an enormous issue, both for COVID response, but also for the longer term provision of social protection. How do we extend coverage to those that are not linked to the formal sector, that don't have social insurance coverage and other mechanisms? So one of the, and again, referring back to the earlier presentation, but just to say that in terms of ways to identify informal sector, in many ways it depends on what is the data structure of the country that you're dealing with. In some countries, there's already a record of many formal sector participation measures. For example, you can look at existing pension records or you know, employer groups, employee groups, and then using excluding criteria, say those people that are not in those systems may be eligible. That's being used in a number of cases. Alternatively, also one can use other sets of records to try to tease out who is in the informal sector. I think Alan was just mentioning migrants as one. So depending on if people you know, have employment from the outside, if they you know, have some documentation which is indicating that they're not already employed in a formal sector category, these things can be used. There's also additional new targeting approaches which are being used. These are not necessarily restricted to the informal sector, but can involve things like call data records and others. So I think there's a lot of exploration that's going on. Different countries are using different approaches. Tina mentioned the Nuvisi program. And I think these are things we need to learn more about and explore going forward. So let me just stop there. Thanks.
Okay, so we are wrapping up. We have 1 minute. Patricia Veloso has posted in the chat the link to both a survey that the organizers invite you to fill out because feedback for all this is extremely important. And also the Google Docs link for the discussion that we just had, where we will be hopefully organizing more of these answers. So unless somebody else would like to say something, there is a last slide with the next. Thank you. That is important. And also the coming up next with the clinic and what else you can do if you have the next couple of hours still to enjoy this wonderful event that we are having. And of course, there is more happening tomorrow. So with that, I would like to close the session, but of course, if anybody has any last minute comments or something to add, please feel free. It only ends when it ends.
Thank you, Rodrigo.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was great.
It was a
Thank you,
pleasure.
everyone.
Thanks a
Thank you.
lot.
Very
Thank you.
nice seeing all of you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Right. So goodbye. Patricia, it's up to you now. You are the boss.
Ending here. Thank you, Rodrigo. Nice to see everyone.